Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Forsyth, that is glorious. When I drove in yesterday, I recognized the Obas immediately. And Carol, my wife, said, "Oh, that looks a lot like you." I recognized it immediately, and my compliments to you, sir, and to the sculptor. It is wonderful to be here today. I'm deeply honored, and it's wonderful to see so many friends. Raymond Heron, who intimidates me somewhat, which is why I've skirted a number of issues about the Boer War. Scott and Kathy Organ, Cookie and Smack Cookson, where Dave and Krisha, they're here. And then the person who intimidates me tremendously as well, Colonel Charles Comley, who is probably the world's authority on Smuts today. And then, of course, Mr. Forsyth himself. I don't get intimidated often, and it's not often a bad intimidation when it does have, but let's say that today I've had some liquid fortifications to overcome such trepidation as I felt. Before I commence, I would just like to make some acknowledgements, if you'll permit me and indulge me. The first is to Mr. Forsyth. Sir, what vision. I stand in great respect. Two of your passions happen to be very important to me. The one is history, the Boer War, and the other wildlife conservation. And at the risk of blowing smoke, I stand in great respect. I think it's wonderful. I think it's glorious. And what an incredible place Kila is here. Last night we were sitting enjoying a little nightcap, and the sound of multiple hooves was heard just outside our wall. And I dashed up to the viewing deck. My room has a viewing deck, ladies and gentlemen. And looking over, there were a whole bunch of zebra. I initially thought it might be a Boer commander from days gone by coming to wish us strength, or more particularly to wish me strength. But what an incredible situation where you can be having a nightcap and go and have a look right down here at a whole bunch of zebra. So thank you, sir, for that. The Boer War is very important. It's an element of history, and history can't be obliterated. It happened. It needs to be acknowledged, whether one necessarily agrees with it or not. It did happen, and regardless of the political dynamics, I think it's so incredibly important that the history of the Boer War is recorded and is acknowledged, because it is essentially that which eventually led to union. If it hadn't been for the Boer War, there would have been no union in 1910. That is just a given. So I think it's critical that it is acknowledged. I need to also say thank you to Craig Butler. Craig sent me a mail some months ago saying, you know, we're having this event and would I oblige by coming along. And I must be honest that I am probably the world's worst correspondent. Mercifully, Craig isn't. And he badgered me. And it was not for any reluctance on my part. It's just that I'm, frankly, if you excuse the Free State expression, I'm slapgat. And Craig, thank you for your tremendous arrangements, your very gracious hospitality, and really, very much appreciated. On the odd occasion in my life, I've been lucky enough to be enjoyed VIP status, and on very seldom, but on the one or two occasions, I've even been lucky enough to enjoy VVIP status. Now, here I need to thank Glynis Dupont. Where's Glynis? There she is. What incredible hospitality. It has been absolutely fantastic. Really attentive and extremely pleasant staff. And as I say, the room I've been very lucky to occupy is bigger than most South African homes, I think. But really, really splendid. So thank you all so much for that. At the risk of overcoming my intimidation, let me kick off. Jan Smuts, whom I will call the Obas, it's how I grew up knowing him, was born on the farm Boerenplaats near Rebekwest on the 24th of May 1870. Boerenplaats, which was later abbreviated to Boerplaas, was one half of the original Smuts farm, which was called Ongegund. Now, my literal translation of Ongegund is unfavored, possibly, which means I'm really, really happy that my branch of the Smuts family moved off that section, because otherwise who knows what would have happened. The Obas's father is a farmer of quite some success, and a man of quite some standing, and in fact served as an MP in the Cape Parliament. And interesting, when he retired from the farm, he went and built a house in Rebekwest adjacent deliberately to his friend Dani Malan's house. And Dani Malan was the father of D.F. Malan, who was to become a very staunch political adversary of the Oubaas. The Oubaas was the second of 9 eventually children. My great-great-grandfather had 2 wives, excuse me, and as such as the second child was destined not to undergo formal education. Such education as he would have received would have been op sy ma se skoot, as it was put in those days. And his future was to be a farming one. And then fate intervened, and in 1882, the eldest Smuts' son, the Oubaas' elder brother, Michiel, died rather suddenly, and at the age of 12, the Oubaas went to Die Ark, the school in Riebeek West, for the first time. At the time, his father described him as a queer young fellow without much intelligence. 4 years later, he matriculated. I've been battling with that concept for a long time. It took me 12 years, and I battled every single one of those 12, and how to do it in 4, I'm not entirely certain. After which he went off to Victoria College, which is now Stellenbosch University, where he graduated in 1891 with double degrees in science and literature. Requiring Greek for his final examinations, he took 6 days off to swat Greek literature and emerged with the top marks in the Cape Province. It was at this time that the Oubaas met Isabella Margarita Tricher of Libertas in Dorp Street in Stellenbosch, who is later to marry and who everybody knew then and later as Icy. The Oubaas success at Victoria College secured him the Ebden Scholarship to study at Cambridge University, and thus it was in late 1891 he entered Christ College to read law. Again, his academic prowess was evident when he became the first student ever to sit both parts of the law tripos in 1 year, graduating, as it was put at the time, brilliantly first. Many years later, Lord Todd, the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge, was asked who the 5 most brilliant students were ever to attend Cambridge, and he thought for a while, and he said, in fact, there were only 3, Milton, Darwin, and Smuts. While in England, in 1894, the Oubaas wrote his first philosophical book, entitled Walt Whitman, A Study in the Evolution of Personality. In 1895, he returned to Cape Town, where he was admitted to the Cape Bar, while supplementing his income with political journalism. Quite obviously, advocates in those days didn't earn what advocates do now. An earlier manifestation of Oubaas's political inclination was when he became a very strong supporter of Cecil John Rhodes, not least of which his Cape to Cairo concept, and which agreed with the Oubaas's developing ideas, which would later manifest themselves when he published his book, Holism and Evolution. In 1897, the Oubaas moved to Johannesburg and married his beloved Icy. A year later, in 1898, at the age of 28, he was appointed State Attorney of the Transvaal Republic by President Paul Kruger. In 1899, now well soured with matters British, he penned what has been called an impassioned tract, Een Eeuw van Onrecht, or A Century of Wrong, passing comment on the influence and activities of the British in what was to become South Africa. It is written in classic High Dutch and translated into English by Icy. At the outbreak, and I'm skirting this is the Boer War, I'm skirting this deliberately, and I've told Ray I'm doing so, because if I see Ray sitting there cocking his eyebrow, I'm going to get even more intimidated. In 1899, plans were already in place for the eventuality of the outbreak of the Boer War, with the idea that Durban and other ports would be taken by the Boers to prevent the British from offloading troops. The Boers were convinced that in so doing, Britain would sue for peace. The Mutual Assistance Pact that existed between the Transvaal Republic and the Free State saw to it that substantial forces were mustered very quickly, but after some heartening early victories, they were stymied by their commander, Commandant General Piet Joubert, who the Oubaas later described as passé and hopelessly incompetent. After an initial success at Nicholson's Neck, when 400 British were taken prisoner, Joubert refused to press home the advantage, saying it would be barbarous to pursue a beaten Christian foe. Sounds like a Muslim saying, doesn't it? Worse was to follow when General Joubert laid siege to Ladysmith, keeping Boer forces tied up while the British were able to disembark troops at will. General Edwards Buller, while attempting to relieve Ladysmith, suffered a series of reversals, but help was on its way as troops poured into the country under the leadership of 2 new generals sent to resolve matters, General later Lord Roberts of Kandahar and General later Lord Kitchener of Khartoum. Interestingly, on the 15th of November 1899, a British train was captured between Frere and Chevelly, and a young war correspondent for the Morning Post was amongst the prisoners, having been captured by Louis Botha. His name was Winston Spencer Churchill, and the defiant young man claimed immunity as he was a non-combatant and a journalist. It was pointed out to him, however, that he was wearing a pistol, and he was sent to Pretoria for detention. He later escaped to Lorenzo Marques, having swum the mighty Arpies River. And for those of us who know Pretoria even vaguely, certainly today it wouldn't take much swimming. In fact, a small jump would probably get you over. And you'll avoid the water, the continent water inside anyway. In later years, the Obas and Churchill were able to reminisce about this time with some amusement on both sides. It seems the Obas took a liking to Churchill, and shortly before Churchill's escape had authorised his release, which served only to amuse Churchill even more in later years. The Obas spent this time running the Transvaal government, as well as making a trip to the front where he did his level best without success to get some action out of the Boer generals. In early 1900, the British had mustered extensive forces, and soon Kimberley, Mafeking and Ladysmith fell, followed in March by Bloemfontein, and General French with his 1,000 wagons pushed the Boers north towards the Transvaal Republic, where Pretoria was to be the last stand. The government of the Transvaal Republic foresaw that the defence of Pretoria would be futile, and with the approval of President Kruger, the Boers broke into small, highly manoeuvrable groups called commandos, and so commenced what some regard as the first application of guerrilla warfare, and some say by the finest expedients thereof. The Obas were dispatched to the Western Transvaal with General de la Rey, and hit-and-run attacks were carried out, which, apart from disrupting British activities, allowed the Boers to replenish stocks of food, ammunition, and critically tobacco. To counter the effectiveness of the commandos, General French started implementing a scorched-earth policy, which, while effective in certain respects, served only to harden Boer resolve and cause bitterness that continued until recently, and in some cases still today. I actually got into a bit of a dispute on Facebook recently about precisely that, a long time after the case. At the fall of Pretoria, Icy, or Jan Smuts, was exiled to Pietermaritzburg, where she was allocated a house, unlike the other Boer women and children who were housed in tents under the most appalling conditions. In May 1901, the Boers were facing grim prospects, and hoping for negotiations, Kitchener permitted the Obas to contact President Kruger, who was by now in exile in Utrecht in Holland. The old president said to keep on fighting. I call him the old president deliberately. If in the family you spoke about Oom Paul, you would be chided. He was never Oom Paul. He was always referred to as the old president, or the old president. At a conference of the Boer leaders in Wartime near Standerton on the 20th of June 1901, it was decided that the Obas should lead an exploratory force into the Cape Midlands. This Cape expedition was said later to be the most daring and brilliant venture of the war. Venturing forth with 362 men, 2,000 miles were covered, and they managed to keep 35,000 British troops occupied. I think, Mr. Forsyth, in one of your brochures, you actually make reference to the number of troops and the exponential number that he managed to detain. By the end of the recce, half of the original 362 were casualties, and yet the number of forces with the Obas had swollen to over 3,000. And it was then that they heard of the peace meeting at Vereeniging. What is of interest is that during the Cape venture, the Obas and 3 men were ambushed, and he had his horse shot from under him, but managed to, by the use of dongers and ducking and diving, to escape capture. The British party was led by an officer named Hughes, and the same officer, Hughes, had carried out house inspections on the Smuts residence in Sunnyside in Pretoria. What is interesting is that he was subsequently to become a close family friend, and as a colonel was to serve as a staff officer on the Obas' staff. And in later years, Omar Smuts in fact teased him about the fact that the British quite obviously couldn't shoot straight. His son and biographer said that the Obas feared more the shame of being captured than being killed. Possibly there's a lesson here for us South Africans to put the past behind us and take a person on his merits rather than his perceived history. As it is said, it is pointless fighting for a better past. After the Boer War, the Obas entered politics with his very dear friend and fellow Boer General Louis Botha. Botha had a rather more gregarious personality than the Obas, which Bernard Friedman described as, in the conduct of affairs, the graciousness of Botha was matched by the generosity of Smuts. Botha allowed Smuts to do all the work, while Smuts allowed Botha to enjoy all the prestige. In 1915, the Obaas accompanied Botha to German Southwest Africa, and early in 1916 he took over command of the Imperial troops in German East Africa, where he chased General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck around for quite some time, and he never did catch him. In fact, the only thing that the South Africans ever really did catch was malaria. After the cessation of hostilities in 1918, the Obaas and General von Lettow-Vorbeck entered into correspondence, and they became very close friends. During the Second World War, the Obaas heard that General von Lettow-Vorbeck was living in abject poverty in his native Germany, he obviously being a Kaiser's-man rather than a Nazi. And the Obaas utilized his efforts and his influence quite obviously with the International Red Cross, and had food, clothing, and even fire materials sent to General von Lettow-Vorbeck. And General von Lettow-Vorbeck thus survived the Second World War, and their friendship continued. A story from the East African campaign related by General Kenny van der Spey, who until his death was the oldest living pilot in the world. They were sitting around a campfire one night in German East Africa, and one of the soldiers said to the Obaas, "General, I believe that you have a photographic memory. Is there a way in which you could demonstrate it to us?" And the Obaas said, "Yes, has somebody got a book?" And Uncle Kenny doesn't remember what book it was, but a book was duly sought, and he does recall that it fairly small print. And he said to the soldier, "Just open up and read. Just open the book and read." Which he did, and he sat staring at the East African sky with his chin in his fingers like this, and after 2.5 pages he really shouted, "Stop, stop," and then repeated word for word the 2.5 pages that had been read. Another thing that eludes me about family genetics, how things like that can go missing in 3 generations. In 1917, the Obaas went off to London to attend the Imperial Conference, and was announced in England thus by Winston Churchill. Churchill said, "At this moment there arrives in England from the outer marches of the Empire a new and altogether extraordinary man. The stormy and hazardous roads he has travelled by would fill all his scenes and sets of a drama." On May the 15th, 1917, very shortly after his arrival, the Obaas addressed both Houses of Parliament, saying the following: "I think the very expression empire is misleading, because it makes people think we are one community to which the term empire can appropriately be applied. We are a system of nations. We are not a state, but a community of states and nations. If we are not an empire, why call ourselves one? If we are something new, we had better give ourselves a new name. Let us take the name of Commonwealth. This is the fundamental fact we have to bear in mind, that the British Commonwealth of Nations does not stand for standardization or denationalization, but for the fuller, richer, and more various life of all the nations that are comprised in it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the Commonwealth, as you know it today, had its beginnings. There, during this First World War, no more valuable commodity than coal. And in October 1917, the coal miners of Wales went on strike due to poor wages and living conditions. At the time, the Royal Navy had precisely 1 week of coal reserves left, after which Britain could literally not be defended. Industry would grind to a halt, and the war effort would come to an abrupt and catastrophic end. The Obaas said at the time that were the strike to continue, we should be paralysed and finished. Prime Minister David Lloyd George, himself a Welshman, decided that negotiations to end the strike would be the work for a Boer rather than a Briton, and the Obaas was dispatched westward with the parting advice from Lloyd George that the Welsh loved to sing. On arrival, he received an honorary doctorate from Cardiff University, whereafter he proceeded to the coalfields, arriving in Tony Pandy in the evening, where tens of thousands of coal miners had gathered, many of them, let it be said, out of curiosity to see what an African looked like. The Obaas introduced himself thus. He said, "Gentlemen, I come from far away. I do not belong to this country. I have come a very long way to do my bit in this war, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about this trouble. But I have heard in my country that the Welsh are amongst the greatest singers in the world, and before I start, I want you all to sing me some of the songs of your people." There was a brief silence, and then a man in the crowd started singing "Land of My Fathers." Swiftly the others joined in and sang the anthem with characteristic fervour, after which a great silence came over the masses. The Obaas then addressed them, and he said, "Gentlemen, it is not necessary for me to say much here tonight. You know what has happened on the Western Front. You know our comrades in their tens of thousands are risking their lives. You know that the front is just as much here as anywhere else. The trenches are in Tony Pandy, and I'm sure you are moved by the same spirit as your comrades in France. It is not necessary for me to add anything. You know it as well as I do, and I'm sure you're going to defend the land of your fathers, of which we have just sung here tonight, and that no trouble you may have with the government about pay or anything else will ever stand in the way of your defence of the land of your fathers. Back in London the following afternoon, the Oba said that the strike was over and the crisis averted. When asked by cabinet colleagues how he'd managed to end the strike, he answered, "The land of my fathers saved us." In the same year, 1917, the Obas declined the offer of the command in Palestine, declined also a seat in the House of Commons, and was made a member of the War Cabinet. When he arrived in London, going back just for a bit, the city, amongst others, was suffering bombing acts primarily by German Zeppelins, with surprisingly serious results. Very basic bombing in those days. There'd be a Zeppelin and Fritz would be on that side and Hansen on this side, and they'd literally pick up bombs and drop them over the edge of the basket. But they're causing a tremendous amount of damage. The Obas was appointed to a two-man committee, along with Prime Minister David Lloyd George, to investigate how to put a stop to these raids. Lloyd George immediately excused himself from the committee, saying he was a Welshman and knew about coal and not much about war, and pleaded ignorance of matters combat and left the task to the Obas. The Obas tucked into the assignment with his customary vigour, and within 2 weeks, on the 19th of July, had produced his first report, which recommended 4 courses of action. The first was the concentration of executive command under one senior officer of high ability, and I quote, 2, immediate concentration and disposition of AA guns. 3, the rapid completion and training of air squadrons to fight in formation, and provision of sufficient air defence units to cope with the attacks on London. Now, for somebody like Wing Commander Cookson, this would be second nature, but it came as a surprise to them then. The recommendations were accepted in toto by the War Cabinet and implementation instituted. The Obas, however, was not done, and on the 17th of August, just less than a month later, presented unsolicited and even more radical report. This report has subsequently been described by Air Vice Marshal Tony Mason in 1986 as the single most important document in the history of air power. The second report represented a paradigm shift in conventional and accepted thinking. Air Chief Marshal Sir Jock Stirrup said in late 2005 words to the effect that the thinking contained in the second report was so far-reaching as to be difficult for traditionalists to comprehend. In the second report, the Obas suggested that air power should have an offensive role, not just a defensive one, as was Britain's practice at the time. Due to the groundbreaking nature of what he was suggesting, Obas drew a parallel with the role of artillery, saying that artillery was a weapon, an instrument ancillary to a service, but one that could not be an independent service itself. He went on to elaborate. Air service, on the contrary, can be used as an independent means of war operations, far from and independently of both Army and Navy. As far as can be presently foreseen, there is absolutely no limit to the scale of its future independent war use. And the day might not be far off when aerial operations, with their devastation of enemy lands and destruction of our industrial and popular centres on a vast scale, may become the principal operations of war, to which the older forms of military and naval operations may become secondary and subordinate. In our opinion, there is no reason why the Air Board, which at that stage was the Joint Service Committee, should any longer continue in its present form, and there's every reason why it should be raised to the status of an independent ministry in control of its own war service. And that has happened literally in every single war since. In essence, the Obas said that Britain could win the war the following year if she mobilized her inventive and mechanical genius to produce sufficient aircraft to strike hard at the enemy's communications and deep into his homeland. For this, an independent air staff and air ministry were required. The basic recommendations of the report were: 1, an air ministry be set up as soon as possible. 2, an air staff be set up as soon as possible. 3, that the Royal Naval Air Service be merged with the Royal Flying Corps. 4, that the Air Service keep most close contact with the Army and Navy. And 5, that the air staff attached to the Army and Navy such unit necessary for military and naval operations. And the War Cabinet accepted the Obas' second report. The Obas had created for himself a mountain of work. Lloyd George passed the proverbial buck back to the Obas, who became chairman of a new air organisation committee. Of the more difficult task was to persuade the Admiralty, typical naval, hey Scott. Of the more difficult task was to persuade the Admiralty to part with the Royal Naval Air Service and to get sufficient production from British industry. The Obas had seen at that stage that neither the Navy nor the Army were likely to win the war, even if they did combine their resources. To achieve this, an Aerial Operations Committee was established, later to become the War Priorities Committee, again with the OBAS as its chairman. This committee had the power to determine all questions of industrial priorities, independent of the War Cabinet, at the time an unheard of situation. What had happened is it effectively placed the OBAS in charge of Britain's industry, from the provision of raw materials, what was to be produced, as well as the question of manpower, which is a unique situation even by today's more liberal standards. With an understanding the British way of doing things that only an objective viewer, viewing from the outside, could have, the OBAS managed, without detriment to the Army and Navy, to pull all the loose ends together. On the 1st of April 1918, the Royal Air Force, the first independent air force to exist in the world, was officially born. Having pioneered the concept of air power and got the Royal Air Force off the ground, that's a pun, I think, it followed that he would wish to have the same happen in his own country. The SAAF got off to a flying start with the Imperial Gift. The Imperial Gift was, according to Carl Birkby, a personal gift from the War Cabinet to the OBAS, who he describes as one of its most forceful members. Officially, the gift was for 100 aircraft, comprising 22 SE-5As, 30 Avro 504 trainers, and 49 DH-9 bombers. Sir Pierre van Reineveld was summoned from Cologne, where he was engaged in the handover of surrendered German aircraft, the Royal Air Force, to the Savoy Hotel in London, where the OBAS kept residence. And he was told, "I want you to go back home to South Africa and start me an air force." Sir Pierre supervised the shipment of the gift to South Africa. And just to show the government hasn't changed much, the shipment to South Africa cost £32,800, and it was offloaded in Cape Town and railed to Pretoria at a cost of £38,300, £6,000 more than the shipping. It is noted that the Auditor General made caustic remarks about the cost of the railage. The whole shooting match was transported to a 23.5 Morgan site, some 2 miles east of Roberts Heights. Roberts Heights was subsequently to become Frederica Hoogte and is now Tabatswani. And this site, 2 miles east of Roberts Heights, had been purchased to become South Africa's first airfield. This airfield was named Swartkop and is still active today, with some of the Imperial Gift hangars still amazingly in daily use. Air Force Base Swartkop is in fact the oldest operational military active airport in the world. The South African Air Force was officially established on the 1st of February 1920, a day that is still celebrated each year. Ours is thus the second oldest independent air force in the world. The OBAS role in the Second World War, if I was to go into that as well, we'd be missing the splendid prospect of dinner this evening, so I'm going to brush over this just slightly. But again, the OBAS found himself as a member of the War Cabinet, and just some snippets from that time. Earl Mountbatten of Burma recounted the following story. It was Winston Churchill's custom, after some late-night entertainment at Chequers, to discuss business with his chief of staff and colleagues. On the first such occasion that the OBAS attended, Churchill opened with, "And now to business, gentlemen." It was well after midnight, and at this the OBAS stood up saying, "Count me out. I am not going to be a party to the killing of your chiefs of staff. They have to leave early tomorrow morning to prepare for their morning meetings. You will be lying in bed smoking a cigar and dictating to a secretary. In the afternoon they will be busy implementing their morning's decisions. You will be having a siesta. They should be allowed to go to bed at midnight and sleep instead of being made to work with you until 4 o'clock in the morning." There was a stunned silence at Smuts' departure. After a long pause, Churchill stood up and said, "Well, gentlemen, I suppose we shall have to go to bed." That is the only time ever that the chiefs of staff were let off the late-night meeting. The OBAS during the years that followed spent much of his time around the world. In 1941, he was appointed Field Marshal by King George VI. In 1943, presided over the War Cabinet in Churchill's absence while he was in Yalta, making him the only foreigner in contemporary history to effectively be Prime Minister of England. In 1945, with peace having been declared, the OBAS went off to San Francisco, where the United Nations was created. The OBAS penned in his cramped handwriting the preamble to the Charter, which is described as an eloquent declaration of humanity's hopes and faith. While not credited with it, it was also said that the ideas contained in the Charter of the United Nations, its constitution, so to speak, its founding document, contained ideas that only the OBAS could have conceptualized. In 1946, he began championing the cause for an independent Jewish state, a cause he was carry close to his heart. Interestingly, I just read today, just by coincidence, that in 1947, on the 10th of September, and it was the anniversary that was recalled, the General Assembly of the United Nations approved the establishment, the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab sections. In 1947, he was awarded the Order of Merit by King George, a signal honour as only 24 people can at any one time hold such an appointment. In 1948, on the 26th of May, the Obas and the United Party were finally defeated at the polls, despite having received a majority of the popular vote. Such is the influence of constituencies. Interestingly, the final act that the Obas performed as Prime Minister, the last thing he did was to recognize the State of Israel. And in so doing was the first head of state in the world to recognize Israel. He said later that he was honoring an undertaking made to his very dear friend Chaim Weizmann. Queen Frederica, much has been said about Queen Frederica and the Obas. I assure you most of it's not true. In her book, A Measure of Understanding, Queen Frederica of the Hellenes portrayed a few interesting facets of the Obas. During the Second World War, while staying in South Africa, she asked him whether he hated the Germans. He answered no. Churchill asked me the same question, and I answered him that I could not hate anybody as much as I hated the British during the Boer War. You grow beyond those baser emotions when you learn to understand people and circumstances. I have long forgotten how to hate. Now I am only sorry for people, for nations, and on rare occasions for myself. This might go some way to explaining how, 12 years after the cessation of Boer War hostilities, he effectively sided with the British when he started his First World War action in German Southwest Africa. When Freddie asked the Obas what had gone wrong, why did his generation, who had already fought one world war, not prevent a second one, he answered, I will tell you why it went wrong. There are three reasons. One is that we Allies believed in France. The second is that America let us down. And the third is that I ran away. He said, I was in England during and at the end of the war, a member of the War Cabinet. The King had privately asked me to stay on and become his Prime Minister. Now, this is an interesting question. Just to break in there, the constitutionality of that is fascinating. And the only reference I have to that is Queen Frederica's. I don't know how that could have constitutionally worked, but nonetheless. I felt my own country needed me as General Boert had just died. I refused, although this would have been a unique situation and opportunity. You see, so I ran away. So do not rub it in. I know my responsibilities. And in a more modern context, Queen Freddie also had this to say about the Obas. India condemned South Africa for not giving enough rights to the Indians. South Africa defeated him for giving too many rights to the Indians. His life can never be judged by one or two defeats. His life can only be judged by his creative and holistic thinking. An interesting story which Charles would confirm is that when Mrs. Pandit was sent by India to the General Assembly of the United Nations, she asked Gandhi, what should she do? Who should she see? And he said, the only person you should see is General Smuts. You go and say hello to General Smuts. And she walked across the floor. She was called by the chair. She walked across the floor, went and stood in front of the Obas and said, Gandhi said, I must come and see you. And Smuts stood up. The Obas stood up and wished her well, had a very charming and happy talk to her, which just goes to show that much of the surface politics that we read about is not reflected on the personal level. So two stories just from a family perspective. Two times that the Smuts family was quite large. There were 7 children, including one foster child. And there were 2 times when a family would disappear. They hid away. If there was a visitor that arrived at Smuts' house that they did not particularly feel like seeing, they hid away. They'd close the curtain, close the door, and sort of be quiet until the car disappeared again. But the other times were that if the Obas said he was going for a walk, the family would scatter. His walk was walking from Smuts' house in Irene to the Pretoria Country Club, where he'd have some tea and then walk back again. But he botanized all the way, and it used to take a day there and back. And the other, which is even more frightening to them, was driving with him. If he said, let's go for a drive, there's nobody available, everybody was gone. He used to drive, and apparently the most astonishingly awful driver. He used to drive and he'd see something, because he was always on the very vigilant and looking out for things. And if he saw something and he'd want to say to the person next to him, he'd actually look at them while he was pointing that to them. And not forget to look at the road, which meant that the other cars had to scatter to let this clown come through. On the 11th of September 1950, after a drive to his farm, Rest of Winter on the Springbok Flats, the Obas retired to bed, where he just literally keeled over and passed away, and thus came to an end one of the most internationally influential voices and forces of the 20th century. Churchill had this to say on the death of the Obas. He says, "In all the numerous fields in which he shone, warrior, statesman, philosopher, philanthropist, Jan Smuts commands in his majestic career the admiration of us all. His friends' overpowering sense of impoverishment and irreparable loss is the measure of the gratitude with which we and the lovers of freedom and civilization in every land salute his memory." And I will leave you with just one thought of the Obas. He wrote at one stage, "There is still hope for our human race. Look at those mountains. They took millions of years to be what they are and have not changed. Compared to them, we are a great success. Look at the short time we have lived on this planet and look at our minds. It is not in us a colossal creative power. Surely this wonderful world where holism can produce the laughter of children, the dreams of lovers, the poems of poets, and the arts of painters and musicians. This is a good world and we must never complain." Mr. Forsyth, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me.